November 23, 1939. The Great Conference Hall of the Reich Chancellery, Berlin. 200 seasoned German generals stood before their Führer, shadows thickening under the storm clouds that had gathered over Europe. In the space of just 1 year, the Wehrmacht had already swallowed the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Yet, Adolf Hitler, standing resolute before his stunned general staff, was not stopping. He ordered the continuation of the war, demanding an immediate attack on France and Great Britain. To the military chiefs, the command sounded nothing less than suicidal. Their adversary appeared formidable. France boasted Europe's largest army, and Britain commanded powerful naval and air forces. On the Western Front, both sides fielded roughly equal forces of around 3.3 million men. Hitler, lacking any military training, having never been an officer or commanded a battalion, ignored all the figures and campaign plans. He was convinced that his instinct pulled rank on all their stripes. The Führer claimed to have a gift for simplifying things, believing his professional officers were stuck in their old ways. However, it was a general, not Hitler, who provided the radical strategy that would initially validate this dangerous arrogance. On February 17, 1940, Hitler met with General Erich von Manstein, the Wehrmacht's most radical strategist. Manstein proposed a novel campaign plan. Like Hitler, Manstein believed they must be bold and take the enemy completely by surprise. The plan launched on May 10, 1940. The Luftwaffe immediately began bombing French, Belgian, and Dutch airfields, destroying over 100 planes before they could even leave the ground. The next day, the Wehrmacht attacked Belgium and the Netherlands. As France and Great Britain rushed their best troops north to stop this seemingly main offensive, they fell directly into Manstein's trap. The thrust into northern Belgium was merely a diversion. The true decisive attack unrolled simultaneously in the Ardennes Massif, a region previously deemed impossible for tanks to cross. This audacity was, for Hitler, the key to success. The challenge of seizing Sedan fell to General Heinz Guderian, a fierce advocate of the Manstein Plan. He issued an audacious challenge to his tank drivers. "We get to the Meuse in 3 days. On the 4th, we cross it and we take Sedan." On May 10, 1940, the countdown began. Guderian launched his tanks, the panzers refusing to slow down for obstacles, charging up hillsides in a frantic race. The sheer, unprecedented speed paralyzed the scattered French troops. Just 2 days later, Guderian reached his goal, only 10 kilometers from Sedan. Though French aviation spotted the lightning advance, the military staff in denial judged the aerial information absurd, convinced the sole German offensive was further north. The following night, repeated aerial photos showing the German tanks racing ahead were dismissed as a nocturnal trick of the light. Guderian had benefited from luck, but suddenly, the rear of the Wehrmacht found itself paralyzed in a colossal traffic jam. Neither Manstein nor Hitler had accounted for the insufficient number of Belgian roads to support such a huge armada. The troops feared bombardment, but due to a crippling lack of coordination, the Allies missed their chance to halt the invasion, allowing the last tanks to join Guderian unhindered. The Meuse River remained the final obstacle between Guderian and total victory. Covered relentlessly by Stukas bombing enemy positions, Guderian's 60,000 men and 22,000 vehicles managed to cross the river under a hail of fire, their tanks reaching the far bank almost intact. It took less than 4 days for the Germans to seize Sedan. Learning the news, Hitler was exalted, writing, "It's a miracle, a real miracle." But at the precise moment victory was assured, Hitler himself compromised it. Guderian, pursuing the Manstein Plan without waiting for official orders, had cornered the Allies at the Channel. 300,000 British soldiers were trapped at Dunkirk, at the mercy of the Wehrmacht. However, Hitler, the amateur strategist, panicked, fearing a possible counterattack that would imperil his precious tanks. Ignoring his staff, he interfered directly with the field operation, confirming on May 24 that his tanks had been halted. The struggling Luftwaffe was ordered to finish off the Allies, but it was rapidly running out of planes against the Royal Air Force. For 2 days, the military staff tried desperately to convince Hitler to change his mind, but in vain. By the time Hitler realized his victory was slipping away, the British troops were out of reach. Between May 26 and June 4, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated across the Channel, having exploited the lull in fighting to hurry back home to fight another day. This successful defeat of France assured Hitler he was the greatest strategist the world has ever seen. The old enemy had been humiliated, forced to sign an armistice in the very railway carriage where German defeat was sealed in 1918. As Hitler returned to Berlin in triumph, his countrymen shared his certainty. Thousands besieged the chancellery, waiting hours to glimpse the man of the moment. To them, he was almost like an all-powerful god. General Hermann Göring gushed that Hitler's genius had caused a revolution in the way wars are fought. Hitler shared this opinion, convinced he had proved his intuition's superiority and invented Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, deliberately neglecting to mention General Manstein's decisive role. Brimming with this perceived genius, Hitler acted on his deep-seated ideology. In December 1940, he decided to attack a new enemy, Stalin's USSR, a land 26 times bigger than France and Belgium combined. The belief that the Reich had to conquer enough Lebensraum, or living space, to ensure the survival of the Aryan race was paramount. His general staff stoked his ambition, certain of success, as the Red Army was weakened and its leadership decimated by Stalinist purges, while the Wehrmacht was at its fighting peak. Hitler, however, made a fundamental error by grossly underestimating his target, bragging that war against the Soviets would be child's play. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa was unleashed, surging 3.5 million German soldiers into the Soviet Union. The objective, mirroring the French campaign, was speed, a knockout blow. The element of surprise paid off immediately. The Red Army's defenses were pulverized, with casualties mounting at a devastating rate during the first week of fighting. Within 3 months, the Wehrmacht controlled over 2,000 kilometers of the front, leaving Stalin himself in shock, reportedly apathetic and depressed. Far from the front, Hitler was satisfied not only with the military progress, but also with the commandos busy exterminating Soviet Jews. This invasion was intrinsically linked to Hitler's anti-Semitic ideology, turning Barbarossa into the world's first genocidal war. Jewish men, women, and children were systematically murdered across Belarus, Ukraine, Estonia, and Lithuania. The SS acted with the backing of the equally anti-Semitic Wehrmacht, involving the entire military hierarchy. In a shocking betrayal of his strategic prowess, General Manstein, the architect of the Western victory, gave the order in early December 1941 to eradicate the male Jewish population of Simferopol in the Crimea. State resources, executioners, vehicles, fuel, and soldiers were provided to meet the deadline, resulting in 11,000 people being shot dead in less than 3 weeks. During this first year of occupation, nearly 1 million Jews were massacred. With things moving like lightning, Hitler blurted out, "The war's already won." So confident was he that he committed his next massive strategic mistake. He chose Leningrad, the USSR's second biggest city, as his main target. However, mid-attack, he changed his mind. He would not attack the city, but lay siege to it, intending to starve its 2.5 million inhabitants. For Hitler, the people were a burden with few pickings for the Reich in northern Russia, so they might as well be eliminated. For months, the soldiers dug in, immobilizing almost 200,000 men in the autumn of 1941, a considerable loss to the ongoing offensive. The Wehrmacht would never overcome the city, losing this important battle. Hitler's only remaining chance to force surrender was taking Moscow, a target his generals had been advocating for months. Hitler finally gave in, despite having previously vowed not to repeat Napoleon's mistake. Though Russian winter was still 2 months away, autumn had already turned the roads into a crippling quagmire. Tanks that should have covered 75 kilometers a day were now struggling to manage 50. On November 13, 1941, the first snowflakes fell, followed days later by a freezing blizzard. The plan was implemented with no foresight. The troops, too far from base, received only a third of their needed supplies. Guderian's tanks were completely paralyzed by Arctic temperatures dropping to -30 degrees. On December 5th, Guderian announced, with a heavy heart, that his troops could advance no further. At that moment, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack, completely taking the Germans off guard. General Zhukov threw 10 battle-ready armies at the Wehrmacht, mobilizing every resource, from infantry on skis to the civil population. Hounded and scattered across an overstretched front, the Germans were overwhelmed. Drivers, grooms, and bakers were brought up to swell the ranks, but it was a total waste. Like Napoleon before him, Hitler was doomed to retreat, leaving behind tens of thousands of cannons and trucks and suffering catastrophic casualties. German losses during the Battle of Moscow from October 1941 to January 1942 exceeded 500,000 killed, wounded, and captured. Moscow was safe. Hitler took the failure hard, blaming his generals rather than recognizing his own errors. The war in the East was no longer child's play. When facing the undeniable failure of the Blitzkrieg in the East, Hitler would not recognize his error. Instead, he blamed his incompetent generals. Von Brauchitsch, then in charge of the entire invasion, was immediately stripped of his duties. To replace him, the Führer chose the only man he entirely trusted: himself. Despite the disaster, Hitler's first decision in his new role as commander-in-chief was to forbid the men to fall back. General Guderian, who had returned to favor after a period of disgrace, warned Hitler that this decision would cost them the cream of their officers. Hitler was unmoved, replying, "I have the right to demand of any soldier that he sacrifice his life. You should back off." Following this, Guderian was sacked, and 35 generals suffered the same fate that winter. Hitler seemed to believe that leading an army was merely a formality. The facts would soon prove otherwise. From now on, Hitler was also in charge of logistics for the land army, and the stakes were crucial because the Wehrmacht was running out of fuel. Within 3 months, they would have none left. Hitler desperately needed oil and came up with a risky plan. He would seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, thereby strangling the Soviet Union while simultaneously cutting off supplies on the Volga River. This would be 2 birds with 1 stone. Time was of the essence. Hitler pinpointed a crucial spot on the supply route, Stalingrad, targeting it not for its name, but for its armaments factories. In the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht made its move, but the troops advanced too slowly for Hitler's liking. Impatient, he changed his strategy. To get to both the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad at the same time, he split his forces in 2. Each of the 2 fronts thus found itself fatally weakened. The amateur strategist never doubted for an instant that they would succeed, but his chief of staff was dismayed, recognizing that Hitler's chronic habit of underestimating the enemy was becoming very dangerous. This concern was immediately validated. By the foothills of the Caucasus, the Germans lost hope. The petrol they so desperately needed had gone up in smoke. The Red Army had destroyed the oil wells before they could be taken by the enemy. Meanwhile, at Stalingrad, the Sixth Army, the pride of the Reich, found itself in extreme difficulty. Faced with fierce resistance from the Red Army, the army got sucked into history's first ever great urban battle. The conflict devolved into close-range fighting. Men could die for a staircase, for 1 more floor, or for a street corner. After 3 months of hellish combat, the Sixth Army was still far from victory, and its men were exhausted. Even as the battle raged, Hitler maintained the city would fall in 8 days. A devastated Stalingrad no longer held any real strategic importance, but Hitler refused to lose face to the German public. Propaganda was deployed heavily. On the night of December 24, 1942, many families were led to believe they were listening in on the fight, though that silent night obviously wasn't recorded in the besieged city. The Christmas presents everyone was preparing would never get through. The men of the Sixth Army were dying of hunger, cold, and disease. One soldier wrote, "Hitler's just dumped us here. This is what the end looks like." On the morning of February 2, 1943, 90,000 suffering men surrendered to the Soviets. Marshal Paulus had chosen captivity over suicide, and Hitler was furious. The defeat of Stalingrad was a major turning point in public opinion. Parents who had lost sons stopped giving the Hitler salute. Graffiti denouncing the assassin of Stalingrad and the mass murderer appeared across the University of Munich, and an underground paper openly celebrated the defeat. The distrust extended deep into the army ranks. One officer admitted that all the admiration he had for Hitler as a human being and as the Führer was broken forever. Hitler was stunned by the defeat and didn't dare announce it to the German people. He hid himself away, becoming obsessed with the war, insomniac, and living on tranquilizers. He was turning into a wreck. Guderian, back after a year in disgrace, noticed the difference, observing that the Führer was less sure of himself, had trouble finding his words, and his left hand was shaky. Despite the catastrophic loss at Stalingrad, Hitler remained convinced of his strategic destiny. For the decisive Kursk offensive, he chose the very best fighters, calling on his most modern tanks and best planes. However, the Soviet tanks, while less sophisticated, were twice as numerous, and the Red Army rapidly gained the advantage. By July 1943, Hitler was forced to give up the fight, recognizing that Germany no longer possessed the resources to beat the USSR. The situation grew even more serious as Hitler now faced a new enemy, one even more powerful than the Soviet Union, an enemy he himself had provoked. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, on December 11, 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States. He alone stood up to the world's greatest economic power, gambling that the Americans would be too busy fighting the Japanese to come to the aid of London and Moscow. Hitler had no idea of the power of the storm he had unleashed against himself. Washington immediately mobilized the bulk of its forces against the Third Reich. President Roosevelt sent huge quantities of military equipment to the British and Soviets, including necessary items like tins of corned beef to improve the soldiers' daily lives. Ever since the declaration of war, American planes had been bombing Germany without respite, targeting its cities and industrial centers, leaving Hamburg, Essen, and Berlin in ruins. Then, on June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy with unprecedented force. But another threat awaited Hitler, and this time it came from within his own command. On July 20, 1944, a bomb exploded at his headquarters. This assassination attempt had been organized by a handful of his own officers, resulting in 4 deaths. The Führer miraculously survived, but the event deepened his existing distrust of the senior officers, which escalated into paranoia. He exclaimed, "Now I have proof. The entire general staff is contaminated. But for those traitors, we would have won long ago." The backlash was severe, extending beyond the conspirators. Even heroes of the regime paid the price, such as Field Marshal Rommel, one of the rare officers Hitler trusted, who was driven to suicide. More than ever, Hitler was living on dreams. In a final desperate move, he tried one last wild bet. He planned to attack the Allies in the very place his perceived talents as an infallible strategist were first born, the Massif of the Ardennes. However, the intuition he had relied upon back in 1940 had entirely deserted him. This final Blitzkrieg could never succeed. The Wehrmacht was now just the shadow of the great army that had once brought Europe to its knees. In January 1945, the attack was crushed by the Allied counterattack, resulting in complete failure. Hitler finally admitted that the war was lost, yet he ordered that they will never surrender. He insisted, "We may go down, but we will take a world with us." He spoke to the German people one last time, his voice tired, exhorting them to keep fighting. However, not all Germans were willing to follow the Führer at the cost of their lives. The godlike military leader now looked more like a divine retribution, as one Secret Service report put it, suggesting many now believed Hitler was sent by heaven to punish Germany. The Führer had failed. His charisma had shattered on the rocks of war, penury, disaster, and death. Over the last 9 months of the conflict, more than 2 million German soldiers were sacrificed on the altar of his rage. Whole regiments began surrendering to the Americans, often without a struggle, and the tide of deserters grew. Even as defeat became inevitable, the annihilation of the Jews became Hitler's priority. Nearly 6 million had already perished, but the Führer ordered that no deportee, Jewish or otherwise, must be left alive for the Allies. They were to be either shot dead or sent off on death marches. In the spring of 1945, Berlin was besieged by the Red Army. Hitler never left his ruined chancellery, hiding instead in his basement bunker. He could no longer hide that he was ravaged by Parkinson's. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. Even in his will, he laid all the blame for the war on the Jews and maintained he had done nothing wrong. On May 8, 1945, the Third Reich surrendered.